The faint light of the first morning, as the first rays of sunshine pierced through the curtains, was not a soft light, but a challenge. It was unlike any other morning where one simply wakes up and starts a new day. For Mariana Reyes, that morning marked the beginning of a difficult journey, not just the continuation of a regular workday. She had woken up before dawn, while the world outside still slept, but in her mind, thoughts about work, responsibility, and important decisions kept her from sleeping. Mariana stood in front of the mirror, her eyes staring straight at herself. She knew that, for someone like her, the first Latina woman appointed as chief of police at the Central Police Station in Phoenix, every step she took would be under scrutiny. Every decision she made would not only affect herself, but carry great significance, symbolizing change in a world accustomed to traditional ways of doing things. Her hair was neatly styled, her face bearing the marks of time and the harshness of her profession, yet her eyes remained unwavering. She was a strong woman, not allowing herself any moments of weakness. The heavy feeling she had was not just from the fatigue after a long night, but also from the weight of the responsibility she had to bear. She had come a long way, from a girl growing up in the slums to becoming a police officer, overcoming stigma and prejudice to rise to high positions in the force. But this time, it was a completely different challenge. Not only was it a new role in the police force, but a revolution within the very methods that had been established for so long. Today, she would lead an old police station, where changes in mindset and approach to work had never been valued. It was a place full of shadows from the old generation of police officers, those who had clung to traditional ways of working, preferring to live in the past rather than change. She had heard stories about such officers, those who couldn't accept the changes she represented, those who would do anything to maintain their power and influence in a system slowly being transformed. But Mariana was not afraid. She had prepared herself mentally for the resistance to come, the scrutinizing eyes, the whispers behind her back. She walked to her desk, picked up her police badge, and carefully pinned it to her uniform, feeling the coldness of the metal, but also the immense motivation it gave her. She sighed, not out of fear, but because of everything she had gone through to earn that badge. It was not just a symbol of power, but a mark of a long, persistent struggle. She had proven herself worthy, and now it was time for the world to see that. Meanwhile, at a corner not far from the police station, another veteran police officer, Ray Ford, someone she knew would become one of her biggest adversaries in this reform, was preparing for a new workday. Ray was not a bad person, but he represented the old generation of police officers, those who believed that maintaining power and control was more important than anything else. People like Ray always doubted the abilities of a young woman, especially one with so many new ideas that he could not comprehend. Ray had never respected people like Mariana. He viewed appointing a Latina woman as chief of police as a political substitution rather than a decision based on competence. Ray didn't like change. He had spent 20 years in the police force, witnessing every kind of situation, and he believed that he knew the best way to handle things. Each case, each arrest, each confrontation had become an inseparable part of his life. He believed that, to maintain order, sometimes it was necessary to use harsh methods, even brutal ones. He had seen the bad in this city, and he thought that sometimes you had to fight evil with evil. But now, with Mariana's arrival, Ray felt an unwanted change was coming. He didn't know what it would bring, but he sensed that the world he was familiar with was slowly being upended. Meanwhile, Mariana got in her car and carefully drove through the busy streets of Phoenix. The old houses, towering buildings, and noisy neighborhoods full of life didn't matter to her. In her mind, there was only one thought. She had to prove that this change was necessary. She had to fight not only for herself, but for the people of this city. She wanted to prove that the police were not the enemy of the community, but its protectors. She wanted to create an environment where everyone, whether residents or police officers, could feel fairness and true protection from the government. When Mariana arrived at the station, the atmosphere in the building seemed to be waiting for a storm. Suspicious glances, sidelong looks greeted her as she walked in. Everything in this station had been arranged in its own way, where conservatism and tradition were central. Mariana knew that today would not be an easy day. She walked into her office, took a deep breath, trying to stay calm inside. But she knew, no matter how well prepared she was, the people in the station wouldn't accept change so easily. And thus, Mariana's revolution began. When Mariana embarked on her journey to reform the police force, she carried not only a grand ideal, but also had to face the harsh reality of a system that had existed for decades. It was a world full of barriers, prejudices, and conservatism, where even the smallest change could cause a big shock. She couldn't rely solely on her ideals, but had to find a way to harmonize them with the reality, step by step. That morning, when Mariana walked into her office, the air was still filled with doubt, as if a storm was about to break. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began going through reports, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Today would be a long day, not because of the work itself, but because of the challenges from her own colleagues in the force. As soon as she started her shift, she noticed the scrutinizing glances of the veteran officers watching her from afar, as if they were waiting for her to make a mistake. They were not villains, but in their minds, she was an intruder in a world they had known for decades. And as soon as Mariana began working, she knew she would have to prove that she could change what many of them considered impossible. Ray Ford, whom she knew was an influential officer in the station, was not a bad person, but his conservatism colored every decision with personal biases. Ray had dealt with all sorts of tough situations, and over the years, he had developed a rigid way of working. To him, the police were not just law enforcers, but also people who held control over everything, with no room for weakness or leniency. Ray may have once been the ideal model of the old police officer, but in Mariana's eyes, he was just part of the past she needed to overcome in order to bring about change in the force. A meeting between Mariana and the station's commanders was scheduled for that morning, and it would be her first major challenge. Everyone had grown accustomed to a tough and somewhat conservative leadership style. Somber faces stared at her, not hiding their lack of trust. They were waiting for a reason to deny her authority or at least diminish her influence within the team. Mariana sat across from them, facing each one, each face a symbol of years spent working within this system. She was unshaken, but deep down, she knew that nothing would be easy. The decisions she was about to make could change their lives. Police work is not just about maintaining order. It's about connecting with the community. Mariana began, her voice calm, yet each word carried strength and determination. We need to change our approach to the public. We can no longer maintain the old mindset that people are enemies, that suspicion is the only thing we can rely on. Ray looked at her coldly and then slowly spoke. I disagree, ma'am. The public can't always be trusted. Sometimes we have to act before it's too late. And I don't think that softness or friendliness is the way to protect the public. Mariana felt the tension, but she was prepared for this. Ray, I'm not talking about being friends with them, but we can work with them so they feel that the police are really protecting them, not just controlling and supervising them. A heavy silence filled the room. People exchanged glances. Those who believed in Ray's methods nodded, while others vaguely sensed a change was coming. Mariana continued, but the division within the police station had already started to form. It wasn't just a divide between her and the conservative officers, but also a rift between those wanting reform and those unwilling to change. Later that day, after the meeting, Mariana received a call from one of the veteran officers in the station. His name was Tom Jenkins, a young officer, not particularly outstanding, but still influential. Tom was one of the few willing to accept the changes Mariana was introducing, but he still had many concerns. He called her to express his anxiety. "I understand you want to make changes, but are we really ready? These changes won't be easy. Do you think we can still maintain the public's trust?" Mariana could hear the uncertainty in Tom's voice, but she knew that if they didn't start now, no change would happen. "Tom, change is never easy. But if we don't start now, everything will remain stuck. We can do better, and I believe this police force can do it." The next day, when Mariana went out to supervise a patrol in the central area, she noticed something she already knew, but still couldn't help feeling disappointed about. The veteran officers on the patrol team were not truly connecting with the community. They were doing their job with a cold, indifferent attitude, showing no concern for the people they were supposed to protect. A group of young people passed by, and instead of engaging with them or asking how they were doing, the officers simply watched them coldly. Mariana understood that in order to change, she not only needed to change their way of working, but also needed to change the mindset of each officer in the station. One day, she decided to join another patrol team, not to direct, but to observe and better understand the challenges the officers faced. It was a neighborhood rife with crime, and when she stepped out of the car, the residents' eyes seemed to not welcome her. They didn't know who she was, only that she was part of the force that they had once felt oppressed by. But Mariana did not shy away. She walked up to a group of people, smiled, and asked how they were doing. The residents looked at her with surprise, and slowly, their defensive walls began to crumble. It was a significant moment. Mariana realized that only when the police truly began to listen and understand the pain of the community could they truly change. But this was met with a harsh reality. Not everyone was ready for change. Not everyone in this police station would easily let go of the old methods, the habits that had become ingrained in them. And that was the battle she had to face. How to reconcile her reformist ideals with the difficult reality of the police system she was leading. From the very first days, Mariana understood that power was not easy to hold, especially when it came within the context of an organization built on rigid, conservative foundations. The power in her hands was not just a badge or a leadership seat, but an enormous responsibility, a flame that could burn everything if not properly controlled. And in a police station like this, where every officer carried a long history and methods of working that had been established for decades, her power could easily be challenged, not just from the outside, but from those working under her as well. That day, when Mariana entered the meeting room with the station's commanders, the tension in the room was palpable. They had heard a lot about the changes she was bringing, but no one had truly felt how those changes could transform everything. The people in the room were veteran officers, those who had been entrusted with power and control for many years. And now, they were facing a young woman, an outsider, who carried ideals of justice and change that they could not fully understand. In their eyes, the power she had was not natural. It was something granted to her by a political system they believed lacked practicality and understanding of what really happens on the streets. "We need to clarify our objectives moving forward," Mariana said, her voice echoing in the room, quiet but decisive. "You may continue with the old ways, but I want to emphasize that if we truly want to serve the community, if we want real change, we must go down a new path. We cannot continue working by just looking at the numbers, relying on traditional strategies to handle every situation. We must listen to the community. We must understand them, not just be figures of authority imposing laws." Ray Ford, sitting in the corner of the room, one of the oldest and most influential officers, had always stood firm on his belief that the police must be seen as a powerful force of control, with no room for weakness or leniency. He was a model of the old guard, those who believe that power must be maintained at all costs, and sometimes maintaining order meant using power ruthlessly. "What exactly do you want to change?" Ray asked, his voice cold but tinged with derision. "We protect justice. We're not friends with criminals. Every change you're talking about might make us weaker in the eyes of the people we're supposed to protect." Mariana did not flinch. She looked straight into Ray's eyes, sensing the challenge in his words. "Ray, I'm not talking about being friends with criminals, but we can work with the community in a way that they feel respected and protected by the police, not just controlled from above. We can't only see criminals. We need to see the people living in the community, who they are, what they need, and what they expect from us." Ray's cold stare did not change. He didn't believe in the change she was bringing. He had lived too long in a world where the police were the ones who held control, and in his mind, changing this system was just an illusion. But Mariana knew that this was not just a confrontation between her and Ray. It was a clash between an old generation and a new one, between decades-old methods and the ideals she was bringing. The meeting ended in silence. Not everyone had fully accepted what Mariana had said, but at least they had to admit that she wasn't easily intimidated. However, this silence created significant pressure on her, because power does not just come from the decisions she makes in the meeting room. It also comes from how she faces the real challenges on the streets. And that's where her power would truly be tested. When Mariana walked outside and saw the patrol team preparing for their shift, she realized something she had feared for a long time. Her power would not only be tested in meetings, but also in real situations. The veteran officers still maintained the old ways of working, where toughness and strong control were seen as the core values. They weren't easily open to change. They looked at her as if she was an outsider who didn't fully understand what they faced on the streets. In a high-crime area, while Mariana and her team were on patrol, a tense situation arose. A group of young people was suspected of being involved in drug dealing. While Mariana tried to approach them with a friendly attitude, Ray and the other officers took a completely different approach. They quickly drew their guns and ordered the group to kneel. Mariana immediately ordered them to stop, but Ray did not listen. He signaled for the officers to continue, commanding in a sharp tone. "Don't stop. This is our job," he said, looking at Mariana as though she was ruining everything. Mariana didn't waver. She stepped forward, standing between the team and the group of young people, and said firmly, "We're not solving this issue with fear. We will ask, we will understand, and we will protect justice, not control." That was the pivotal moment when Mariana's power was truly tested. She stood firm, not only opposing Ray, but also everything he represented. The other officers began to look at her, seemingly hesitant, but they followed her orders. The group of young people was not arrested. Instead, Mariana managed to understand their circumstances and provided a reasonable solution to the situation without resorting to force. When the patrol ended, Ray looked at her without saying a word, but his gaze had shifted slightly. Mariana knew that change didn't always come from big decisions, but from the small actions she took every day. And that day, she proved that power doesn't just come from what you have, but from what you do and the values you stand for. Real power is not about domination or control, but the ability to make the right decisions in every situation, to persist with your ideals, and to face challenges without hesitation. Mariana knew that this was just the first step in a long and difficult journey, but she also knew that if she could overcome these challenges, she would change the system she had entered. That day, the atmosphere in the police station seemed heavier than usual. Mariana was accustomed to the tension in her work, But today, there was a distinct difference. She could sense that something was about to happen, an event that could change everything she had been working towards. Power, which had always been tested through decisions and actions, now stood at a major crossroads. She could not ignore this event. A real challenge had arrived, and it would determine whether she could continue leading this police force down the path she had set. When she entered the control room, she witnessed a scene she had not anticipated. A group of young men, about 4 of them, were being yelled at and had their collars grabbed by 3 officers, forcing them to sit on the floor. These individuals were not serious criminals, but the tension from the officers, Ray Ford and 2 of his colleagues, was clearly excessive. The shouts from the young men echoed in the room like a cry for help. The phones of those standing around had already started recording every action. Mariana could feel the gazes of everyone, as though the entire police force and the community were watching. Mariana knew that the decisions made in this moment would have far-reaching consequences, not only for the officers on the team, but also for all the people she was trying to protect. Every reform plan could fall apart if she didn't handle this situation carefully. She had heard of similar incidents, wrongful arrests, escalating tensions due to a lack of patience and understanding. But today, she could not back down. She approached the officers, her voice calm but decisive. "Ray, stop," Mariana spoke, her tone unwavering. Ray turned to look at her, his eyes filled with defiance. He could not imagine that she would intervene in such a situation, one that he thought, by old standards, was entirely reasonable. "This is none of your business," Ray said, his voice cold, though not hiding his anger. "We need to handle this quickly. We can't let them cause trouble in this area." Mariana didn't hesitate. "They're not a threat, Ray. We can't treat them like this. Let them go right now." In that moment, Mariana felt a direct confrontation. Her power, like a blazing fire, was now not just about maintaining respect within the police force, but also about protecting the respect of the community towards herself. She stood firm, unyielding. The eyes of her fellow officers were filled with skepticism, as they were still not used to her leadership. Ray stood there, neck strained, as if wondering whether he would be dethroned in front of his subordinates. However, Mariana knew that in such a decisive moment, silence was not an option. She could not compromise with brutality. She moved closer to the group of young men, who had begun trembling in fear. One of them, a very young boy, looked at her with skepticism, as if not believing what was happening. She knelt down in front of him, looked into his eyes, and gently said, "We are not your enemies. We are the ones who protect justice, and we're here to help, not to harm you." As every gaze remained fixed on her, Mariana was unafraid. She felt the tension dissolve in the young men's eyes, as if they were starting to believe that someone truly cared about them. The group gradually relaxed, no longer as stiff as before. Mariana turned back to look at Ray, and then her words rang out like a judgment for his previous actions. "Ray," she said, her voice clear and strong, "what have you done? Is this how we protect justice? Do you think this way will earn the respect of the community?" Ray didn't speak, but his face began to flush red. The other officers began to realize that things had gone too far. Mariana was not someone to let this situation unfold without intervention. She had stood up for the values she believed in, defending the voiceless people in the community. Mariana turned back to the group of young men, asking them to stand and explain the situation. One of the young men spoke up, his voice still shaking. "We were just standing here, not doing anything wrong. We were forced into this situation just because we were near this area." She listened and didn't rush to make a judgment. These words were the voices of those who had long been accustomed to brutal treatment from the police. Not everyone in this community trusted the law enforcement, and Mariana knew that this wouldn't change through a simple conversation. She ordered the young men released immediately and instructed her team to take statements. But Mariana didn't stop there. She turned back to Ray, her tone firm. This is the last time you cross the line like this. We cannot and will never act like this again. In that moment, as people began to disperse, as the young men left in relief, Mariana knew this was a defining moment in her career. This wasn't an easy victory, but it was the first step toward change. It was the moment she stood up to protect the core values of justice, not only for the threatened citizens, but also for the officers within her own team. It was a declaration that power was not just about control, but about the ability to change and make a difference, even in the face of strong resistance. As the tension subsided, Mariana realized that she could not change everything overnight. But a moment like this could be a turning point, marking the beginning of a new police force, where justice and mutual respect were not just ideals, but realities. And in that moment, she began to build trust, a trust that she knew could only be built through determination and perseverance. Mariana felt the heartbeat of the city with every step she took, not through the crowded streets or the long honks of car horns, but through the subtle tension in the meetings and the silent confrontations. She had proven that she was strong enough to stand up and lead. But today, she knew that only a powerful voice for justice could ensure that the changes she was initiating would not be eroded by the ghosts of the past. She could not let passivity or silence stifle her ideals, especially when those she trusted within the force could very well be the source of resistance. That day, the regular police meeting shifted to a major issue that no one in the room could ignore. A case involving the misconduct of a senior officer. And more importantly, it was part of a system that had existed for far too long. Drug dealing, blackmail, and abuse of power were no longer unfamiliar occurrences within the city's police force. Mariana had received information from a reliable source about an officer, someone who had served for over 20 years, abusing his position to cover up criminal activity. This was no small matter, and that's why Mariana knew she could no longer stay silent. She walked into the meeting room, where the commanders and senior officials were sitting around the large table. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her, filled with interest but also suspicion. They were not yet accustomed to her way of working, and clearly, they were not ready for change. Mariana took a deep breath, feeling every fiber in her body stretch before this moment. Every word she was about to say would not just be a public statement of her authority, but also a declaration of war against conservatism, against the habits that had rooted deeply within this force. We cannot continue to condone misconduct, no matter who it is, she began, her voice sharp and decisive. She didn't hesitate, not at all afraid of the possible reactions from those in the room. Every day, we swear to protect and serve the community. But today, we are facing an undeniable truth. One of our officers has abused his power to harm the very people he was entrusted to protect. The room fell into a deep silence. Mariana could feel all eyes focusing on her, some filled with surprise, others with doubt. But she was prepared for this moment, and she knew that only strength and transparency could awaken everything she had been building. I have received reports about an officer being involved in criminal activities. I cannot let this continue. We cannot continue to protect illegal behavior simply because that person is part of this force. I ask you all to cooperate in investigating and handling this case transparently. The atmosphere in the room froze. Ray Ford, whom she knew would always side with the old ways, was the first to speak up. You can't do this, Ray said, his voice almost full of anger, but also a hint of worry. We can't expose one of our own, especially when we're facing such complicated situations. If you go down this path, we'll lose the trust of the entire team. Mariana looked him straight in the eyes. unyielding. Ray, it's exactly these kinds of thoughts that have caused us to go astray for so long. If we cannot confront our own mistakes, how can we ask the community to trust us? I will not hesitate to handle this the right way, not just for myself, but for everyone who believes in my leadership. Her words were not empty promises. She could feel the tension in the air, but she couldn't stop now. If she stepped back, the ideals she had fought for over the years would be buried in the darkness of conservatism. People in the room began to look at each other, then back at her, as though weighing whether they should follow this path or not. Some agreed, but there were others in the crowd who remained skeptical. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, but Mariana didn't allow herself to waver. She continued, I will make everything public, and I will take responsibility for this decision. We may not agree on everything, but I will do what is right. I ask for everyone's cooperation, not for me, but for ourselves and what we represent. A few officers in the room started nodding. Some others remained silent, but in their eyes, there was no longer the deep skepticism from before. Mariana knew that, even though they didn't fully agree, she had begun planting the seeds for change. And that was the first step of the long journey she had to take. As the meeting ended and people dispersed, each with their own thoughts, one thing was clear. This reform could not be undone. Mariana had placed everything on the line for transparency, justice, and the difficult decision she knew would not be easy to carry out. But the most important thing was that she had spoken out. And when a leader speaks out for justice, not only do the followers listen, but they too, along with the leader, must stand firm and fight for the values they believe in. The next day, when the news of the case was made public, the public began to react strongly. Some supported Mariana's decision, feeling proud to have such a strong and determined leader. Others, especially those within the industry, felt threatened. But through all these reactions, Mariana stood firm. She knew she was on the right path. The truth could not be hidden forever, and justice could not be bought. A few months later, when she stood at a conference on police reform, Mariana looked into the faces of the crowd. These were the people who had begun to change, those ready to stand up for justice and help her rebuild trust between the police and the community. Her words were not just a speech, but a call to action. We cannot change the world with words alone. We must change ourselves first, and when we stand firm for justice, the community will trust us. Mariana didn't just speak for justice. She took action, and her actions created ripples in the hearts of those who witnessed them. And from those ripples, a new future began to form. Mariana could feel the resistance as soon as she walked into the office that morning. The coldness and silence in the air felt overwhelming, as if everyone was waiting for something, a clear sign of what she would do next. But the skeptical glances and distrustful stares remained unchanged. For them, the changes she was pushing for were not just administrative reforms. They were the breaking of long-established principles to which they had adhered for so many years. Some members of the force still could not accept that their way of working had to change, and some had even begun to think about leaving if things became too different. Today, as part of a larger plan, Mariana had decided to hold a meeting with all the commanders within the police force. The goal was clear: find a way to reconcile the long-standing conflicts and restore trust within the team, especially after the recent tensions. But she knew this task was not going to be simple. The police force consisted not only of passionate individuals eager for change, but also those deeply tied to the past, to a system they believed to be right. The changes Mariana was introducing might make these people feel threatened. The meeting began, and the tension in the room was palpable. Each officer, each commander sat in silence, their eyes fixed on Mariana. She didn't speak immediately, but simply observed the people around her, listening to the sighs, the scraping of chairs, and the exchanged glances. It was clear that everyone felt they had no choice but to sit at the same table, to face the inevitable change. But that didn't mean they would easily accept it. Mariana decided to start with a clear, firm statement, without hesitation. Today, I'm not here to listen to criticism or resistance. I'm here to find a way we can work together. I understand that the changes I'm pushing for are not easy, but I need you all to know one thing. We can no longer continue down the same path, a path that has caused the community's trust to diminish and has made us lose our reason for existence. However, as soon as she finished, a strong voice came from the back of the room. It was Ray Ford, who had become a symbol of conservatism within the force. He stood up, his sharp eyes fixed on Mariana, his anger evident. "Do you know what you're doing?" he said, his voice not a criticism, but a warning. "If you continue to follow these ideals, you will destroy this team. We're here to protect the city, not to become weak reconciliators. Justice is not something we can negotiate." Mariana didn't look away, didn't back down. She was too familiar with criticism like this, and she knew that if she didn't stand firm now, she would never gain the respect of those around her. "Ray, I know you're worried, and I understand that," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "But I'm not making these changes because I want to diminish your power. I'm doing this because I want us to truly be the protectors of justice, not just enforcers of laws who disregard the people we are supposed to protect. If we continue working like this, we will only ruin ourselves and your careers." The room fell silent, but the eyes that once held criticism were now filled with concern, with a small recognition of what Mariana had just said. She knew that in order to change the mindset of people like Ray, she couldn't just talk, she had to act. Mariana decided to propose something. "We will create a police council to work with the community. I want all of you to be part of this process. We cannot stand on the sidelines. If we want real change, we must work with the people we serve, not against them." Her words were a heavy blow to the pride of many. The entire police force knew that Mariana wasn't just inviting them to change their way of working. She was inviting them to join a revolution in how they viewed their roles. This wasn't going to be simple, and she understood that there would be much resistance. But Mariana also knew that if she didn't step up and make this change, the police force would never regain the community's trust. That day, after the meeting, signs of reconciliation began to appear, but they didn't come easily. Ray and some other officers still couldn't fully accept what Mariana was proposing. However, a few people in the force started to become more open, and though they weren't many, they began to realize that this approach could help them not only protect the city, but also protect their own values. However, the challenge didn't end there. The battle between the old and the new within the police force was far from over. The conservatives, those unwilling to accept change, continued to resist in silence. But Mariana knew she couldn't stop. Every step she took was a step further in the fight to regain trust and justice for the police force, for the community, and for herself. One evening after the meeting, Mariana sat in her office, looking out the window. She thought about the next steps, about the difficulties that lay ahead. The decisions she was making wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't back down. This fight was not just about power. It was about reconciliation and justice. And when she looked at the faces she would have to lead in the future, she knew that reconciliation was not just an empty promise. It was a practical strategy that she had to implement day by day, hour by hour, until the seemingly impossible became reality. Mariana had begun her journey. She had come to understand that resistance would always exist, but reconciliation could only come when we all accept that change is inevitable. She would continue, not just for her ideals, but for those she was leading and for the community she was serving. Throughout the months of leading the reform, Mariana faced not only resistance from her colleagues within the force, but also the disappointment of the community. who had long been deprived of genuine protection from the police. The trust she needed to rebuild wasn't just about gaining the approval of the officers on her team. It was a much bigger task: how to regain the trust of the people she had sworn to protect. When the police become a symbol of fear, when officers are no longer seen as allies of the community, but as enforcers of power without compassion, how could she change all that? That day, Mariana had just finished a tense meeting with the commanders. Inside, she still felt the weight of the challenges ahead. While the commanders had begun to accept the changes, out there in the community, a deep wound remained, distrust that could not be erased overnight. Protests and shouts against the police force still echoed in her mind. Not all citizens could see the changes she was trying to make, but she couldn't stop. She knew that building trust was a long process, and every step, no matter how small, was part of that journey. Mariana decided to attend a community meeting. This was no ordinary meeting where she could just send an officer to represent her. She had to be there. She had to stand before the people who had lost faith in the police, to listen and understand them. As she entered the hall, all eyes turned toward her. They were eyes filled with suspicion, anger, and disappointment. They had been deceived too many times, and no one wanted to hear a police officer talk about justice or change anymore. But Mariana didn't turn away, nor did she shrink back. She stepped up to the podium, faced those cold stares, and began to speak. "Hello, everyone. I know that you don't trust us. You don't trust the police force. And I understand why. But today, I stand here not only as a police chief, but as a member of this community. I am part of this city, and I have seen the mistakes, the failures that we've gone through together. We can't change everything overnight, but I promise I will do everything I can to help you feel safe and respected." She paused, looking into the crowd, feeling the tension, the skeptical stares, but also the glimmer of hope. She knew that words alone wouldn't make anyone believe in the change. She had to do more, prove it with action, not just words. A man stood up from the back, his gaze challenging, a bit angry. "Okay, you say that, but can you really help us? How can we trust you when the police still just follow orders without really caring about the people?" Mariana had anticipated this question. She smiled gently, looking the man straight in the eye. "I know words can't change everything, but I can promise you one thing. This change won't come from top-down orders, but from what we do every day. I want to work with you. I want to be part of this community, to build a police force that truly serves, not controls, not as the enemy. We will come to you, not to give orders, but to listen and understand what you need." The atmosphere in the room started to soften. Some people began nodding. A few stiff expressions turned into softer ones. But Mariana knew that change wouldn't come immediately, and it might cost a lot of effort and sacrifice. However, she also knew that this was the first step. She had to prove to everyone that the police were not just power holders, but real partners of the community. A few weeks later, Mariana decided to implement a new strategy: unarmed police patrols with the goal of engaging with the community, rather than merely inspecting and imposing power. This was a bold decision, and one that would surely face opposition, especially from the conservative officers. But Mariana was resolute. She wasn't just talking about change. She had to show people that change could actually happen. On the first day of implementation, the unarmed patrol teams walked into neighborhoods they had never dared enter before. The streets were quiet in the early morning, the old houses, the residents peering through windows with suspicious eyes. Mariana knew this was a difficult step, but if she didn't do it now, she would never regain the trust. She led the first patrol herself. No weapons, just a notebook and determination. As she and her team approached a group of young men gathering on the sidewalk, she walked over and smiled. One of the young men, about 18, looked up at her, his gaze hesitant but curious. "We're just standing here, not doing anything wrong," he said defensively. Mariana looked into his eyes and gently replied, "I know. I just want to talk for a minute. Can we sit down?" This scene was completely different from what the officers had ever done. They had never approached the community in this way. But gradually, the young men started to open up, sharing about their lives, the hardships in their neighborhood, the lack of opportunities they faced. Mariana listened, without judgment, without imposing. When the conversation ended, the young man nodded, his face no longer tense. "Thanks for coming. We need someone who listens to us, not just someone who comes to arrest us." It was an important moment, not because everything had changed immediately, but because the change had started from the smallest steps, from the simple yet meaningful conversations. Mariana knew this was just the beginning. Trust couldn't be built overnight, but through continuous actions, through small but consistent decisions. She had opened a new door, where the police and the community could stand together, not as adversaries, but as real partners, working together to build a fair and safe city. At the end of the day, when the patrol team returned to the station, though there were unfriendly murmurs from the conservative officers, Mariana didn't mind. She knew that each step, each decision, no matter how difficult, was a crucial part of the process of rebuilding trust. She would continue, not just for herself, but for all those she was fighting to serve. And when she looked at the faces that had begun to change, she knew she was on the right path. The sun had set, and the last light of the day cast an orange-red hue over the towering buildings of the city. Mariana sat in her office, her eyes focused on the view outside the window. A strange calm enveloped the space. It was an unfamiliar feeling, a quietness that had never seemed to appear during the long, relentless days of work. But now, she knew that all that she had done, every decision, every struggle, every moment of tension, was beginning to bear fruit. The sense of success didn't come from grand victories or swift decisions. For Mariana, success came from small but persistent changes. She couldn't deny that the process had been arduous, and at times it seemed almost impossible to overcome. The early steps of the reform had faced strong resistance, both from within the police force and from the community she was trying to serve. But gradually, change began to take shape. Doubts began to lessen, and in their place came acceptance and understanding. On a Tuesday morning, Mariana woke up earlier than usual. She had grown accustomed to starting her day with phone calls and tense meetings. However, today felt different. Today, she would meet with the community once again, not just with promises, but with the tangible actions that she and her police force had undertaken over the past few months. She knew this meeting would be a significant milestone, a confirmation of the effort she had put in to bring about real change. When she entered the hall, the gazes of the community members still held skepticism, but this time, there was something different in the way they looked at her. They no longer viewed her as a rigid leader, but as someone who genuinely wanted to work for the common good. She began the meeting cautiously, but with confidence. She wasn't there to explain her reasons, but to share the results that she and the police team had achieved, the real efforts they had invested in rebuilding trust with the community. "Hello, everyone," she began, her voice not overly strong but firm. "I know that you still have doubts about what we're doing. You've witnessed failures in the past, promises unkept. But today, I stand before you to share the results we've achieved. We've been working continuously with the community, not just through patrols, but through conversations, meetings to better understand your needs and desires." She looked at a group of people sitting in front of her, some of whom had previously participated in protests against the police force. A man stood up, his face still showing clear signs of doubt. "It's good that you say that, but all we've seen are words. Everything is not enough for us to believe that the police can change. How can you prove that what you're saying is not just a political tactic? Mariana took a deep breath, not angry, but simply looking at the man and smiling gently. I understand your skepticism. We can't change everything just by words, but I can prove that we have started changing through actions. Unarmed patrols, conversations with the community, regular meetings with the citizens. All of these are the first steps toward building trust. The meeting wasn't a battle between her and the community, but a dialogue. Every question, every rebuttal was an opportunity for Mariana to explain and prove that what she was doing was for the common good, not for personal or political gain. When the meeting ended, not everyone seemed satisfied. But one thing was certain: skepticism had lessened. Mariana knew this was an important step forward. After that meeting, she continued with the unarmed patrols. These patrols had become an integral part of her strategy. This time, when Mariana accompanied the patrol team, the community members no longer avoided or shied away as they had before. They began to stop and talk, to share their lives, the difficulties they faced. The police were no longer a foreign force, but became friends, companions in the daily lives of the community. One of the memorable encounters happened when Mariana and the patrol team stopped at a small cafe in the neighborhood. She wasn't the only one entering the cafe. A group of young men, who had once been hostile toward the police, were sitting at a table nearby. At first, they looked at her with suspicion, but Mariana didn't hesitate to approach them. She sat down and started talking to them about life, about the struggles they were facing. There was no confrontation, no threats, just real stories about life in the neighborhood. One of them, a young man named Marcus, looked at her and said, "Thank you for listening to us. The police used to just come to scare us." With conversations like this, Mariana knew that trust wouldn't come immediately. But each step, each conversation, each small action was part of the process of rebuilding the relationship between the police and the community. Every citizen, every police officer was an essential part of this process. And though the road ahead was long, though there would be great challenges, Mariana felt a newfound confidence, a hope not only for herself, but for all those who were working with her to rebuild this police force. The next day, when Mariana walked into her office, she received a message from a community member. The message was brief but meaningful. "Thank you for doing the right thing. We see the change. We're starting to trust the police." These were the first words, but they were a solid first step in building trust. Mariana sat down, looked at the screen, and smiled. She knew that this path would never be easy, but at least now, she could feel the change. The first steps had been taken, and the hope for a future where the police and the community could truly work together had begun to blossom. And that was the reason for her to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for all those she had served and would continue to serve. Mariana's story is not one about power, victories, or easy successes. It is a journey filled with challenges and sacrifices, where she had to face not only external difficulties, but also internal conflicts within herself. What she has gone through, the decisions she had to make, has taught us profound lessons about leadership, patience, and most importantly, trust. The first lesson that Mariana learned is that power is not something to be maintained, but something that must be given and used to serve the common good. Throughout her journey, Mariana realized that, while she is the leader, no power is stronger than the respect and connection with those she leads. When she faced resistance from her colleagues in the police force, she didn't try to impose her power on them. Instead, she used reason and patience to build trust, to convince them of the necessity of change. True power is only valuable when it is used to bring fairness and positive change, not to control or impose. The second lesson she learned is that patience and perseverance are key to any reform. When Mariana began making changes, She faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Conservative police officers were not easily accepting of the change, and the community was equally skeptical about her promises. But during this time, Mariana didn't rush. She knew that everything needed time. Conversations, small but meaningful actions. All of these were necessary steps to gradually change what had been deeply embedded in the system. No change happens overnight, and in the toughest moments, she understood that patience was the key to moving forward. The third lesson was the importance of listening and understanding. In her work, Mariana not only tried to change the way the police force operated, but also had to understand and empathize with the people she served. When she participated in community meetings, when she wasn't just standing on the podium, but also listening, she gradually built trust. The people didn't need a leader who only spoke without truly understanding them. They needed a leader who listened to their stories, shared their struggles, and walked alongside them every step of the way. When Mariana actively approached the community, not with a controlling attitude but with care and understanding, she completely changed the way the community viewed the police force. The fourth lesson is the importance of leading by example. Mariana was not just the one making decisions. She was the first to implement the changes she wanted to see. When she led the unarmed patrols, when she participated in conversations with community members, she proved that change is not about what is said, but about what is done. When a true leader stands behind their words, when their actions reflect the values they profess, that's when they truly lead others. She didn't just ask others to change, but she herself became the role model for those changes. The next lesson is about the difficulty of facing mistakes, both her own and those of others. Mariana had to confront many mistakes, not just from her fellow officers, but also from herself. She had made wrong decisions, lost patience at times, and doubted herself. But the important thing was that she didn't let those mistakes discourage her. Instead, she learned from them, corrected them, and continued her journey. She understood that leadership doesn't mean perfection, but the ability to rise after each fall, to learn from mistakes, and to do better next time. Finally, the greatest lesson Mariana learned was about trust. Trust cannot be built from empty promises, but must come from real actions, from consistency between what we say and do. Trust takes time, patience, and sacrifices. But once it is built, trust can bring about great change. Mariana taught us that only when we place trust in others while also keeping faith in ourselves can we truly create the change we desire. For Mariana, every reform is not just about changing an organization, but about changing the way each person sees their role and responsibility in society. She didn't just work to serve the community, but also to restore and strengthen the trust between the police force and the people they serve. From her lessons, we see that although the path of reform can be arduous and full of challenges, if we stay true to our ideals, listen to and understand those around us, and keep learning from our mistakes, we will surely arrive at a better future. Mariana didn't just change the police force. She also ignited a new hope within the community. She wasn't just a leader, but a builder of trust, not through power, but through persistence, understanding, and tireless actions for the common goal. Her story is proof that one person can change the world around them if they continue to believe in justice and keep moving forward, even in the face of unimaginable hardships.